So a couple weeks ago, I did a big interview with Katie Piper at Canva. She's a lead designer, and we just talked through podcast artwork. What works? What are the common pitfalls? What should you avoid? So that we can create the best artwork possible for our podcasts. And I really wanted to do this video, which is getting Katie to react to your artwork. So I put out a call in the Buzzsprout Facebook group, and hundreds of you put your artwork forward, and Katie picked 10 of them to just walk through step by step. We analyze what's working, what doesn't, what could be improved, and we're always bringing it back to the design principles in that other video. So we'll link that one in the description, but let's jump into podcast artwork reactions with Katie Piper.
Here we go.
So if we pull them up, number one is the Mighty Warriors podcast. And this is done by Colette, who's a huge, I'm a huge fan of her podcast and of her. So I'm so excited that you picked this one. So tell me about this artwork.
Well, I think Colette has done a really great job here. I think I love the photo of her first and foremost. I mean, the podcast is by her. From my quick understanding, it was kind of like an inspirational kind of spirituality sort of podcast. So I think the photo of her, she's done a great job. It feels aspirational. She looks really inviting and professional and super friendly. She looks like someone I want to take advice from or, talk about spiritual things with. I think so. The image of her looks fantastic. I love the font choices she's chosen for the Mighty Warriors. I think the lockup, which is what I would call that, which it's just like a little lockup, the Mighty Warriors podcast. I think the font choices are really nice. She's chosen like a really subtle serif for the and Mighty Warriors is really nice, and bold, and podcast is in the same one. So I feel like that is a really nice lockup. And she's put some really good hierarchy in those fonts. The things that she could try, however, in this is that lockup is so great, but it is so small, unfortunately. So you're losing a little bit of the legibility when that gets down into a thumbnail size. So I don't know how much room she has in that image. I think the image is fantastic. I think maybe she could try about thinking about some of those design elements like balance and scale a little bit. So I would recommend scaling up that lockup, the Mighty Warriors, and placing it in the top left of that podcast, and maybe trying to shift her image down a little bit to the sort of bottom right. Not completely so she's a shrunken small focus, but just so the first thing that you're seeing in that design is the Mighty Warriors podcast, which is the title, which is really, really important. So just about switching up that layout a little bit and playing with scale here could really help improve the next iteration of this design. But again, I think it's a great start for Colette.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. All right, let's jump to number two.
No worries.
All right, what did you pick for the second one?
So I picked energy healing. I hope that is correct. So the imagery for this one is, it really gives you so what's working here, I think, is the imagery gives you a really strong sense of what the podcast is about. It's relaxing and really meditative. So it feels like a calming podcast. I know I'm going to talk about something to do with like my inner journey and meditation, etc. But unfortunately, there's just a little bit too much going on in this podcast. So although the extra taglines are really helpful with journey through the chakras and healing comes from within, they help me know what the podcast is about. Maybe it's worth just choosing one of those taglines to include. Again, I don't think you need podcast in the title here, as it's not part of the title of your podcast and people know it's a podcast already. So things to try maybe for version 2 of this design is sitting down with that question, what's the main thing I want to say, and prioritizing information. So energy healing should be the main title and the main focus of this podcast. So again, I'd play with scale and make that really large. And then I'd reduce the sub copy, which has to either be one or the other, can't be both, unfortunately. But healing comes from within or journey through the chakras. I think you can repurpose some of that copy for the description and just keep that main punchy tagline in the artwork. Also, the font here, journey through the chakras, it's losing a lot of legibility. It's a beautiful font, but because of the busy background, you're losing legibility. So I would maybe make energy healing a lot larger and choose a much more simple font for the tagline or the subtitle. So energy healing could be a really decorative, nice, large font, and then the smaller one could be journey through the chakras and use like more of a neutral font, so it's easy to read through that at a glance. So they're the sort of things that I would work on to sort of try and evolve this design a little bit more to the next level.
And then we've got this logo kind of in the center. And I'm sure that this podcast is related to a business or something that this logo is associated with, or maybe it is connected to chakras, and I'm just showing my ignorance right now. How would you use this in the design? Because we've got a little bit of it kind of hanging over the woman's arm in the photo. Yeah,
definitely. So I think logos are very, very important, but unless the key thing in this podcast is the company or the brand that's bringing out the podcast, I think you can reduce it a lot more and maybe balance it in the center at the bottom and move all the information above it. So when using logos, you have to stack them so they're not like equal weight to everything else. At the moment, this logo isn't necessarily locked into a good spot. It's just kind of with a white square. So you could try reversing the colors in the logo if you wanted to do that, if you had that capability, or if not, just doing a nice little white square in the bottom right with the logo can be a really clean execution, and then keeping it all separate from the text and the headline. So I think it's about, again, thinking about the hierarchy of information here, and maybe trying to put things in a better sort of alignment so people know what's the most important thing to read. And the logo is important, but as you said, like podcasters have the luxury of having this really lovely big description that they can put information to. So I think it's nice to have a little touch point of the logo and maybe elaborate more a little bit, like this podcast is brought to you by XY company in the description.
Great. All right, let's head to number 3.
So number 3 is Corporatainment by Amora. I love this design. A++ to Amora. I think it's really nicely done. I think awesome. She's really clever with how she's highlighted art because of the different spelling in this as like a fun little italicized feature, and it's in yellow. I love black and white. The photo of her, again, looks super inviting. I want to sit down and talk to her about, I think it's about people in the creative industry or working in like creative fields within the corporate industry. So I think it's a really, really nice and inviting podcast. I love the details on the side of the frame that she's used. It feels like a really classic execution. She's also chosen a really nice kind of impactful headline font, and then really chosen a nice neutral hosted by Amora Brown font below, and use that line to create a little bit of separation and hierarchy in her design. So I think she's done a really great job. Literally the only thing, and this is me stretching for some feedback here because I think this is good to go, but I noticed that if you zoomed in, there's a little bit of a drop shadow or a double up in the lettering of Corporatainment, the headline. I just think she can remove that because it's not needed. There's enough contrast in the background. It looks a little bit cleaner without the drop shadow and stuff. Drop shadows are really useful if you want to make it stand out off a really messy background, or if it's a font that relies on a drop shadow. But I think she can remove it for this artwork because I think it's pretty much good to go as is.
So number 4, Haunted Hospitality by Robin.
Haunted Hospitality by Robin. So something that she did really great here, and I'm obviously Australian, I don't know if you can tell from the accent, but I didn't understand the reference of pineapples being strongly associated with Southern hospitality. But so I think it's really clever that that's put into the artwork, because I kind of sets you up for like the haunting tales of hospitality that are sort of based in the South. So I think it feels really spooky and suits the content. Things to try with this design, however, is I love the curved text Haunted Hospitality. It feels like a nice lockup with the pineapple, but there is just a little bit, there's a lot going on with the illustration. So the background, even though this is a great example of great contrast, the background still has a little bit too much detail in it because the pineapple has a lot of detail in it. So I think it's about choosing, if you want to keep the background more detailed and feeling a little bit more haunting, maybe choose a more simplified version of a pineapple that you can sort of go with, or vice versa if you want the pineapple to be really ornate. I think I zoomed in and it looked like it had little eye details or little flourishes like that in the pineapple. So maybe the background becomes a little bit more subdued. There's a lot of illustration and pattern going on in this design. So it's just a matter of toning that down a little bit. And I do like Haunted Hospitality. I think that is like a fun, haunted feeling typeface. But you could maybe try a few other options just to help with legibility, again, at a smaller scale. it's a fun typeface, but because of the way it's curved and when it gets scaled down, you might lose a little bit of legibility. So I might try playing around with a few different kind of typefaces for this one, still keeping it handwritten and haunted feeling, but just maybe reducing the too many flourishes and details in that.
Great. All right, number 5.
Number 5 is Gen X Stories with Eve and Friends. I like this. This is a great example of really strong hierarchy in a title. So Gen X Story stands out, and then with Eve and Friends underneath is really nice. This also, we were talking about fonts kind of being related to decades a little bit. This reminds me a lot of like a 90s kind of nostalgic typeface.
Yes.
And it's fun. I think it suits the generation and the stories they're talking about. So it is really fun to have that level of nostalgia in the typeface for this, if that's what you're going for. If that's not what you're going for, then that's not great. But I assume that it is. Because it is with Eve, I do really like that the host is a picture in the background. However, there are just some things to try with this one. The illustrations, even though I know this has a sense of nostalgia in it, the little chat illustrations, I don't know if they're needed. They can feel like maybe a little bit dated and not as cohesive with everything else. So you could try doing maybe more of a rigid, structured kind of illustration in the background, or I would even just scrap that and keep things really simple and just kind of like zoom Eve into the background a little bit more so she becomes more of the feature, because there's like a nice graphic treatment that she's put on that image. So I think it's about just reshuffling this a little bit and maybe making the picture of Eve more of the background art versus Eve and something else. So simplifying that a little bit more.
I think when you talked about nostalgia, the shape that's around with Eve and Friends, that screams like early 90s to me. And it totally takes me back to, I was pretty young, but it still takes me back to that time. And so, I think that was great.
Yeah.
All right. Number 6.
So number 6 is We Thought You Been New by Yardley or Jardley. I'm not too sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize. I love this one. This is amazing. A++, nothing, absolutely nothing I can give it feedback on. I think this is a really good example of how to make the title the main graphic device here. It feels like it's like akin to like the Dropout kind of podcast graphic, or like just a really strong, thick, interesting typeface that they've used here. I also like the feature of the background. It feels nice and graphic, but it also feels like very secondary, which is nice because I think you're instantly sort of reading the title and it just feels like a really nice kind of interesting podcast graphic. This would be a podcast that I would definitely be drawn to and listen to, because I would have thought that some design effort's been put into the design. So no feedback. Feedback is great job.
All right. The feedback is, this is the perfect artwork. So
yeah.
I love that. I see the title, I read the title, and then I see the cassette, and then I see the play, and then I see the podcast. And it's kind of like, it felt very clear to me, like I was walking through separate steps of learning more information and getting a better feel. Because once I see that play, I'm like, okay, we've definitely got this very distinct, like 90s nostalgia again.
Yeah.
And
it's definitely nostalgic.
I'd be excited to kind of learn more about this podcast. All right. Number 7.
So number 7 is Just Victoria by Victoria. So this one I think is nice. I think the illustrations feel quite trendy to me. It feels like it would appeal to a millennial or Gen Z kind of audience. It's very feminine and modern, which I'm hoping that that's kind of what the stories are about. It talks about beauty, wellness, and tech. The only thing with this one is the spacing maybe is a little bit off. So beauty, wellness, and tech, and Just Victoria, which is the title of the podcast. Just Victoria is great. It's a bold, you can read it. That's the name of the podcast. I love that. So the hierarchy you've created in the fonts here is really great. I would just shift everything up a little bit. So thinking about kind of like creating a little bit more white space or negative space above the illustration's head. So I would reduce the space between beauty, wellness, and tech and Just Victoria and make them more of a lockup. And maybe would even make them a little bit bigger and push them up to the top, more towards the top of the design. And then I would even try and scale up the illustration just a touch more so it fills the space a little bit more. So either side sort of touching the side of the design. And then host Victoria Moser down the bottom. because the illustration is so soft and beautiful and feminine with its line work, the thick black box down the bottom maybe feels a little bit heavy, and it maybe prioritizes that information more than the graphic needs, because you've already got a great tagline, you've got a great title. The title is also the host name. So I think you could choose a softer color to kind of highlight that as like third information, or like a footer of the design versus a really thick black box. It might help, keep that the title, the bold thing that I want to look at, and then focus not on the nice illustration. And then the host is kind of like the last thing that I need to read about.
And one of the things that kind of stood out to me was host Victoria Moser is actually off. It's not totally centered, right?
Yeah, it isn't centered. There's so that's alignment as well. So there's way more space on the left than there is on the right. So there are lots of cheap ways to do this. I mean, you could literally make a little box, put it on one side, copy it, and put it on the other, and center the text that way. But if you're using something like Canva, if you're using the new Canva plugin through Buzzsprout, there is on the top right side, there's an alignment sort of tool. So you can click on that, click on your text box, and it will center it automatically for you. So I would definitely try and make everything fit. This is a very symmetrical design, or it should be a symmetrical design. So everything should be centered along a middle point, and that definitely includes the footer at the bottom.
Great. All right. Well, I think there's a ton that's working here really well. And I think this is one I'm excited to share with her because, like you're saying, it's kind of small tweaks here. And then this one really has a lot of things working for it right now.
Yeah, it's got a lot of things working for it. It's just, a few spacing tweaks, color tweaks, and alignment tweaks.
All right. Perfect. So number 8, companies that care.
Companies that care. So what is working well for this graphic is it's a really clear, bold title, and it's a good example of scale, making the title the most important aspect of it. The imagery also, it gives me a sense of like it's a very compassionate kind of image. There are things to try. There's quite a few things to try for this one, though. There's a lot going on in terms of information on the page, and not all of it might be that necessary. So again, company that care and podcast, because there is so much going on, I would just scrap podcast. I probably wouldn't put that in the title. I would definitely scale up companies that care a little bit more. And Fertile Ground and the Hosted by Marie. Hosted by Marie probably doesn't need to be bold because, again, you want to kind of emphasize the title as being the most important thing. And there's a lot of thick kind of font weights here. And Fertile Ground is going to be a hard logo to sort of align with, because even though it's a logo that's kind of weighted on one side and left aligned, it kind of feels like it's something that you want to center because it's quite a long one. So I would potentially shift companies that care up to the top and making it large and sort of do balance through tension on this one, and either left align Fertile Ground and then left align Hosted by Marie underneath, so it becomes a really clear alignment, because there is a fair bit going on, unfortunately. If you could, I don't know, it depends on what the brand guidelines are behind Fertile Ground, but you could also just pull out the logo of the tree and have the icon of the logo in there. It doesn't have to be the whole big lockup. You could just keep it simple with the icon on the logo centered above the Hosted by Marie underneath. So that's something I would do in terms of the type. In terms of everything else, the color here is probably, it's like a gray blue. It feels reliable and trustworthy, but it also feels a little bit corporate and conservative. And I know this is about companies that care, but I feel like it's going to be talking about companies that have environmental initiatives or human rights initiatives, things like that. So I feel like a more positive blue would work here, or maybe like a nice green tone to kind of have the association with sort of companies that care on a global sort of scale. So changing up the color here might make it feel a little bit more modern and also have a stronger emotional association with the content of the podcast. Also, the imagery, although it is compassionate, and I instantly know it's going to be about people doing something nice and empathetic for the world, it maybe feels a little bit too stocky, and like I've seen it before. So I would maybe choose something that is a little bit more unique for this. So maybe it's a matter of doing a full bleed image, and a full bleed image is an image that covers the entire graphic. So a complete image,
Okay.
having a really thick, bold title, and then just shifting around some information a little bit more. So there's lots of like fun things you can try with this graphic to kind of take it to that next level for sure. But for now, it's a great use of scale. Just pushing that a little bit further on simplifying the amount of information in there would really help.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that was one of the things that I noticed when I looked at it is when we think about artwork is really the thing that's catching your attention and then hoping to direct you to the title. The title is going to have companies that care in the title, and titles are almost always right there next to the artwork. And then we've got that description where, man, we can just go super in depth about the Fertile Ground Communications is actually producing this podcast, I believe. Obviously, people will know it's a podcast, so we might be able to drop that piece, and we can put lots of host information. It's very freeing for me when I remember we have those other assets. They're right next to the image that are often going to be working in conjunction with the image to give us all of that information.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Do you have time for two more?
I got time for two more.
All right. Number 9, the Daily Dribble.
So number 9, the Daily Dribble. So this is very clear to me instantly. So what's working for this one is it's super clear, and I know instantly what the podcast is about. It's about basketball or sports in general, I assume. So well done on the clear messaging. The things that aren't working for this design, unfortunately, is I love simple and clear design. I think that's the best way for especially short, impactful kind of graphics. However, maybe this one's a little bit too sparse. So I would try adding a background in here. So I would maybe make the background a little bit more interesting. I know the white can be nice and clean, but maybe adding in like a really graphic texture in the background, maybe switching out that basketball for a really great picture of a basketball or something that feels a little bit more eye-catching and interesting. I love the curved text. I think it's a nice use of kind of locking up the illustration and the text together really nicely. The only thing is that font, I probably would try and avoid using italics in curved text. It's definitely a case by case call, but in this case, I think maybe it's losing, it just makes the text maybe feel a little bit oddly aligned. So I would definitely try and choose a different typeface here, just because this feels a little bit too simple and like I've seen it before. So maybe like a thicker, more sports focused typeface would be nice, or like something that feels like a varsity college kind of typeface, something that people will quickly associate with sports. So a little bit more energetic and a little bit more action packed in the font choice here could be really, really, really useful. So this is like a great starting point. And you've definitely prioritized the 2 points that you want to get across, which is sport and the title. It's just about fleshing that out a lot more into a much more interesting and eye-catching graphic.
Yeah, you can't look at this title and this image without knowing exactly what the podcast is about. And I think that it's easy to get way down the line of all those design tips that you gave us and totally forgotten, hey, what are we trying to get across in this title, in this artwork?
Yeah.
And so I really like that Nick and everybody else working on this podcast, you're doing a great job making sure people know when they see this, you're doing a daily podcast about basketball. If you're doing something if your podcast about anything else, I'm going to be shocked. I'm pretty confident this is a daily podcast about basketball. So you've definitely nailed that aspect of it. All right. So number 10.
Number 10 is Martha Runs the World by Martha. So this one is, so what's working for this design is, I think the little graphic that Martha's created here is really quite sweet. It's like shows a journey around the world. I really like how podcast is weighted on the bottom right. However, there's quite a lot of room for playing around with different elements in this podcast. So as we've mentioned a few times already, the scale of a podcast is scale of podcast is the goal, but the scale within design is really important in terms of hierarchy. So it's a cute graphic, but it's just really, really small and on a white background. So if I'm scrolling through a ton of podcasts, I'm just going to skip this one because I can't read it. So I think step number one would be scaling up that illustration to be really large and really fill the space of that 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels. Also keeping in mind, it gets shrunken down to, I think you said 55 by 55 sometimes. Right. So really filling the scale of that. I think we can drop podcast off here again, as well, as we've mentioned a few times. People are looking for a podcast, so they know what they're looking for. This is a personal choice, but I want to see who's Martha. I want to know what she looks like. Where's Martha in this? I would love to see a picture of Martha in there, or I'd like to see a little illustration of Martha sort of running along the graphic or something. There's lots of different ways. If Martha's maybe a bit shy to put an actual picture of herself in there or doesn't want to do that, she can definitely add like an illustration of like a woman running around the world or something like that. This one also uses, this is an example where color might be a little bit too minimal. So the blue and the white, great color choice, lovely, stands out really nicely, but it might just not be the right color for this particular podcast. So this is, maybe it's nice to put in like a really fun yellow behind because it's like an adventure kind of thing. Or I think you could play around with color a little bit more here and either add in a little bit more detail to that globe. So maybe it's a picture of an actual world and then it's got an illustration of a woman running around it and kind of like a graphic element that makes it feel like it's a movement around the globe. Like that could be a really nice interpretation of this kind of style of illustration. Another thing with this is the type Martha Runs the World. It's a beautiful typeface. I like that typeface. It's like a thick, really nice serif font. It's just getting lost when it scales down, like it's being sort of yelled and echoed into the distance. So that's fine. It just needs to be a lot larger if that's the effect that you're going to put on it. So it just needs to be legible at a glance. So it's all, again, scale. So scaling that up is step number one, and then maybe adding in a few more interesting elements to make it a little bit more eye-catching and a little less corporate feeling could really help here.
If anyone wants to learn more about you, is there a place for them to go, or should people steer clear?
Oh, yes. If you do want to learn more about me, you can look me up on LinkedIn, Katie Piper, or my website is piperpiperdesigns.com. So feel free to check out either of those places.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who watched this. We hope your artwork looks great. If you ever want feedback on it, come on over to the Buzzsprout Facebook group. We'd love for you to share it. And maybe, if this video gets enough likes and comments, maybe we'll get Katie back on the channel and we'll critique more artwork together. But until next time, thanks for watching and keep podcasting.